October 15, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of eastern France stood shrouded in fog so thick that visibility extended barely 20 meters in any direction. Corporal James Washington of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the few all-black combat units in the American Armed Forces, pressed himself against the cold earth of a forward observation position, his rifle steady despite hands that trembled not from fear, but from the bone-deep chill that had settled into his joints after 3 days without proper shelter. The men of his unit, scattered in foxholes behind him, believed they were safe in this dense morning mist, that the German forces occupying the high ground ahead could not possibly see them, could not possibly know they were there. They were about to discover just how wrong that assumption was. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew, not even Washington himself as he whispered that quiet prayer into the grey dawn, was that his actions in the next 30 minutes would not only save the lives of 47 men, but would fundamentally challenge everything his own army had believed about who deserved to fight, who deserved to lead, and who deserved to be called a hero. This is the story of how one man's faith, skill, and impossible decision transformed not just a single morning in France, but the future of an entire generation of soldiers who would follow in his footsteps. James Washington had been born 23 years earlier in a 2-room house outside Tuskegee, Alabama, the youngest of 6 children, raised by a mother who cleaned houses and a father who worked the railroad. His hands first learned steadiness, not from military training, but from following his grandfather into the woods before dawn, where the older man taught him that hunting was not about killing, but about patience, about reading the land, about becoming so still that you disappeared into the world around you. His grandfather, whose name was Thomas, and who had been born on a plantation in 1857, would wake young James at 4 in the morning during hunting season, long before even the earliest light touched the sky. They would walk in silence through the pine woods that stretched for miles behind the Washington property, Thomas moving with a grace that seemed impossible for a man in his 70s, James following in footsteps that barely disturbed the fallen needles that carpeted the forest floor. Those walks were education in more than hunting. They were lessons in observation, in patience, in understanding that success came not from rushing forward, but from knowing when to move and when to remain absolutely motionless. Thomas taught his grandson to read the woods like other children learned to read books, pointing out the subtle signs that indicated where animals had passed, what they had been doing, where they were likely to go. A bent blade of grass could tell you how long ago a deer had walked by. The pattern of scratches on a tree trunk revealed whether a buck had been marking territory or simply scratching an itch. The behavior of birds could warn you of predators before you ever saw them yourself. All of this information existed in the world constantly, Thomas explained, available to anyone willing to learn the language of the forest. By the time James was 12 years old, he could track a deer for 3 miles through pine forest and place a shot through a gap in the branches, no wider than a dinner plate. But more importantly, he had learned something deeper than mere mechanical skill. He had learned that true marksmanship was not about the weapon or even about the target. It was about controlling yourself, about achieving a state of calm focus where breathing became automatic, where the rifle became an extension of your body, where the moment of firing was simply the natural conclusion of perfect preparation. Thomas Washington, who had experienced both the absolute powerlessness of enslavement and the dignity of freedom, understood that teaching his grandson to shoot was about more than providing a skill. It was about giving him a sense of competency, of mastery over something in a world that would constantly tell him he was inferior. When James placed a perfect shot at 150 yards, hitting exactly where he had aimed, Thomas would nod and say quietly, "Remember that feeling. Remember that you did something difficult, and you did it perfectly. Nobody can take that away from you, no matter what they say about what you can or cannot do." Those words would echo in James Washington's mind years later on a rock outcropping in France, when the weight of impossible odds pressed down on him, and the voice of doubt whispered that one man could not make a difference against such a force. His grandfather's voice, teaching him that steadiness of hand came from steadiness of heart, and steadiness of heart came from knowing exactly who you were and what you stood for, no matter what the world tried to tell you about your worth. When James enlisted in 1942 at the age of 21, he did so knowing that the army he joined did not believe men who looked like him could fight as well as white soldiers. The military of that era maintained strict separation of forces, assigning black soldiers primarily to service and supply roles, excluding them from most combat positions based on theories about courage and capability that had no foundation in fact, but deep roots in prejudice. The 92nd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers in honor of the black cavalry units that had served with distinction in previous conflicts, was one of the few exceptions, though even they faced constant skepticism from higher command. Washington and his fellow soldiers trained at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, a sprawling facility in the high desert near the Mexican border where summer temperatures could reach 115 degrees and winter nights could drop below freezing. The physical environment was challenging enough, but the psychological environment was perhaps more difficult. The men of the 92nd knew that every mistake they made would be attributed not to individual failure, but to racial inferiority. They knew that they would need to perform twice as well to receive half the recognition. They knew that officers and enlisted men from other units watched them with skepticism, waiting for them to fail so that existing prejudices could be confirmed. The training was deliberately intense, designed to prepare them for the brutal reality of infantry combat, but also, perhaps, to break them, to prove that black soldiers could not meet the standards required. They marched 25 miles with full equipment in the desert heat, learning to function through exhaustion and dehydration. They practiced squad tactics in the rocky terrain that surrounded the fort, learning to move as coordinated units under simulated fire. They spent hours on rifle ranges, not just firing at static targets, but engaging moving targets, shooting from awkward positions, learning to function under stress and time pressure. For Washington, the rifle range became a place where he could distinguish himself in ways that were undeniable and measurable. While other soldiers struggled to qualify at ranges beyond 200 yards, Washington consistently placed shots within a 2-inch circle at 300 yards. His instructors, white men from various parts of the country who brought their own prejudices to Fort Huachuca, could not dismiss or diminish his performance because the targets told the truth. The holes in the paper did not care what color hands had fired the rifle that created them. One instructor, a former Marine named Sergeant Harold Dutton, who had served in the previous conflict, pulled Washington aside after a particularly impressive shooting session. "Son, I have been teaching men to shoot for 15 years, Dutton said quietly, looking around to make sure no one else could hear him expressing what might be interpreted as excessive praise for a black soldier. I have seen maybe 5 natural shooters in all that time, men who did not just learn the skill but seemed to be born understanding it. You are one of them. Wherever you end up in this conflict, make sure your officers know what you can do. Make sure they put you where that skill can be used, because it would be a criminal waste to have you carrying an ordinary rifle doing ordinary soldier work when you could be doing what you were clearly meant to do." Those words stayed with Washington, though he did not fully understand their significance until much later. At the time, he simply nodded respectfully and continued his training, trying to be excellent at everything without drawing too much attention, navigating the complicated social dynamics of being a black soldier, in an army that had not yet decided whether it truly wanted black soldiers in combat roles. The division had arrived in Italy in the summer of 1944, thrown immediately into the grinding campaign up the Italian peninsula, where casualties mounted with every mile gained. Their first engagement was a relatively minor action, clearing German forces from a series of farm buildings that had been converted into defensive positions. The company Washington served in, then commanded by a different captain who would later be killed in a mortar attack, approached the position with excessive caution, having been warned by higher command that their performance would be closely watched and evaluated. The engagement itself was brief and brutal, lasting perhaps 30 minutes of actual fighting after days of approach and preparation. Washington fired his M1903 Springfield for the first time at another human being, a German soldier who appeared briefly in a window of one of the farm buildings. The distance was approximately 140 yards, a shot that Washington could have made with his eyes closed given his level of skill. But the reality of shooting at a person rather than a paper target made his hands shake for just a moment before his grandfather's training took over and steadiness returned. The German soldier dropped from view. Whether Washington's shot had hit him or whether he had simply moved behind cover for his own reasons, Washington never knew. But he discovered in that moment that he could do what was required, that the moral weight of combat did not paralyze him the way it paralyzed some soldiers, leaving them unable to function effectively. He felt neither pride nor shame in the action, only a kind of grim acceptance that this was now his reality. This was what service in a combat unit meant. Over the following weeks and months, the 92nd pushed slowly up the Italian peninsula, taking positions, defending against counterattacks, taking more positions in the grinding incremental warfare that characterized the campaign. Washington distinguished himself early, his marksmanship earning him assignment as a designated marksman. Though the army of that time did not officially recognize the term sniper for soldiers in regular infantry units, the designation was unofficial, conveyed more through the fact that officers began positioning him in places where long-range precision fire might be needed, rather than through any formal change in his military occupation specialty. He carried an M1903 Springfield rifle with a mounted scope, a weapon that had been the standard American service rifle in the previous world conflict, but was now considered somewhat outdated compared to the semi-automatic M1 Garand most infantry carried. However, for precise shooting at distance, the bolt-action Springfield remained superior, its manual operation allowing for careful placement of each round, the very slowness of the bolt action enforcing discipline and deliberation. Washington learned to love that rifle, learning its quirks and tendencies, understanding how it performed under different weather conditions, how the cold affected its accuracy differently than heat, how wind pushed bullets in patterns he could predict and compensate for. He also learned the difference between target shooting and combat shooting, a distinction that no amount of range time could fully prepare someone for. On a range, you had unlimited time to prepare controlled conditions, no one shooting back. In combat, you had seconds to identify a target, assess range and conditions, make calculations that became increasingly unconscious with practice, and fire before the target disappeared or before enemy fire forced you to take cover. The ability to maintain precision under those conditions separated true combat marksmen from range shooters who simply had good technique. By October, the 92nd had pushed into France as part of the broad Allied advance following the invasion that summer. Their objective was to clear German forces from the Vosges Mountains, a region of dense forest and steep terrain that provided natural defensive advantages to anyone holding the high ground. The German armed forces of that era, despite being pressed on multiple fronts, remained formidable opponents, particularly in defensive operations where they could leverage terrain and prepared positions. The unit Washington belonged to, Company C of the 371st Infantry Regiment, had been tasked with securing a valley approach that intelligence suggested was lightly defended. That intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The morning of October 15th began like the previous 3 days had, with thick fog that reduced the world to a grey void of unclear shapes and muffled sounds. Captain Robert Morrison, the white officer commanding Company C, gathered his platoon leaders at 0400 hours in a shallow ravine that served as their forward command post. Morrison was a complicated man, a lawyer from Philadelphia who had been raised to believe in equality as a principle, but had never actually known any black people before taking command of this unit 6 months earlier. His initial assumption had been that he would need to provide extra supervision, extra guidance, extra structure, but 3 months of combat had taught him that the men under his command were as capable as any soldiers he had ever seen, and considerably more motivated, given what they were fighting to prove. "We move at 0530, Morrison told the assembled group, which included Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, a black officer from Detroit who led 2nd Platoon, and Staff Sergeant William Hayes, who commanded the platoon that included Washington. "Division wants this valley secured by nightfall. Intelligence indicates minimal opposition, probably a rearguard company at most. Lieutenant Bradley, who at 26 was one of the oldest men in the company and had developed an instinct for danger that came from being black in America, long before it came from being a soldier in Europe, frowned at the map. "Sir, that intelligence came from air reconnaissance 3 days ago before this fog set in. They could have reinforced significantly since then, and we would have no way to know." "Noted," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he did not share Bradley's concern. "But we have our orders. We advance in column formation. 2nd platoon takes point. 1st platoon follows at 50-meter interval. 3rd platoon secures the rear. Washington, you and the other designated marksmen will move with the command element. If we make contact, you will deploy to provide overwatch while the platoons maneuver." Washington, who had been listening quietly while cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that morning, nodded. He had learned not to speak unless spoken to directly in these meetings, not because he lacked opinions, but because he had observed that suggestions from enlisted men, particularly black enlisted men, were rarely welcomed even when they proved correct later. He had also learned to trust the knot of unease that now tightened in his stomach, the same feeling he used to get as a boy when his grandfather would suddenly stop during a hunt and signal for absolute silence, having sensed something wrong that his younger senses could not yet detect. The company moved out 30 minutes later, 168 men advancing in a column that stretched nearly 200 meters through the fog-shrouded forest. The visibility remained so poor that each soldier could barely see the man in front of him, navigating primarily by sound and by occasional glimpses of shapes that might have been trees or might have been fellow soldiers. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that had absorbed enough moisture from the fog to muffle footsteps, creating an eerie silence broken only by the occasional clink of equipment or whispered command to maintain distance. Washington moved near the center of the column with Morrison and the command group, his rifle held at ready position, eyes constantly scanning the gray void for any sign of threat. The fog created strange optical effects, making nearby trees appear to shift, and distant shadows seemed to loom closer. Several times in the first 20 minutes of movement, soldiers froze, certain they had seen movement ahead, only to discover it was fog swirling around a tree trunk or a low-hanging branch shifting in a breeze too gentle to feel. They had advanced perhaps 800 meters when the world exploded into chaos. The sound came first, a sharp crack that echoed strangely in the fog-dampened air, followed immediately by a cry from somewhere ahead. Then came the distinctive rattle of machine gun fire, the German MG-42 that American soldiers had nicknamed the buzzsaw for its incredibly rapid rate of fire, capable of 1,200 rounds per minute, compared to the 400 to 600 of American machine guns. The sound multiplied, indicating not one position but many, and suddenly the fog that had seemed to provide concealment revealed itself as a trap, blinding the American soldiers to targets, while the German forces established in prepared positions knew exactly where to aim. "Contact front," someone screamed, the words nearly drowned out by the increasing volume of fire. "Multiple positions. We are walking into a full defensive line." Morrison dropped to one knee behind a fallen log, yanking out his map, even as bullets snapped through the air overhead. "All platoons, establish firing positions and suppress. We need to determine enemy strength and disposition, but establishing firing positions required seeing something to shoot at, and the fog provided no such visibility. The German forces, by contrast, had clearly positioned themselves during the previous days of poor visibility, marking fields of fire and setting up interlocking positions that could sweep the entire valley approach. The American soldiers, caught in the open and unable to see more than a few meters, could only press themselves into whatever cover the terrain provided and return fire blindly toward the muzzle flashes that appeared as brief orange blooms in the gray void. Washington, working on pure instinct developed through years of hunting, immediately analyzed the situation, not through what he could see but through what he could hear. The machine gun positions were elevated, probably on the ridge line that the map showed running parallel to their advance, approximately 200 meters to the northeast. The firing pattern suggested at least 4 weapons, possibly more, with additional rifle fire coming from positions between them. The American column had walked into what military tacticians called a killing zone, an area that had been pre-registered for fire, so that even in poor visibility, the defenders could effectively engage targets. "Sir," Washington said to Morrison, keeping his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them, "the machine guns are stationary and elevated. They are firing on predetermined bearings. If we can mark their positions, I can provide counterfire. But someone needs to get me to higher ground with a clear angle to that ridge." Morrison looked at him, and in that moment, Washington saw the calculation happening behind the captain's eyes, the weighing of whether to trust his designated marksman's assessment or to follow the doctrine that said to call for artillery support and withdraw until heavier weapons could be brought forward. The problem with doctrine, both men knew, was that artillery could not be accurately called in this fog, and withdrawal meant leaving 2nd Platoon, which had been in the lead, and was now pinned down somewhere ahead in the killing zone. "Sergeant Hayes," Morrison called out, "get Washington to that high ground on our left flank, the outcropping we passed about 70 meters back. Give him security and whatever he needs." Hayes, a powerfully built man from Louisiana, who had worked as a longshoreman before the conflict, nodded and grabbed 2 other soldiers. "Washington, let us move and move fast. Stay low and stay quiet." The 4 men crawled and ran in alternating bursts back along the route they had advanced, bullets occasionally cracking overhead, but most of the fire concentrated ahead where the main body of the company was pinned down. The outcropping Morrison had referenced was a jumble of large rocks that rose perhaps 6 meters above the surrounding terrain. Not much elevation, but potentially enough to provide a sightline over the intervening fog layer if Washington could get to the top. The climb took 3 minutes that felt like 30, hands and boots searching for purchase on cold, wet stone while the sounds of the engagement continued behind them. Hayes and the 2 other soldiers, Privates Raymond Coleman and Joseph Wright, positioned themselves at the base of the outcropping to provide security, their rifles trained outward on the fog that could conceal enemies approaching from any direction. Washington reached the top of the outcropping and immediately understood both his advantage and his challenge. The elevation did indeed allow him to see over much of the fog layer, which from this angle appeared as a grey sea, with the dark shapes of ridgelines and treetops emerging like islands. He could see the muzzle flashes of the German positions clearly now, bright orange pulses that marked each burst of machine gun fire. But he could also see how many there were, and his stomach sank with the realization. Not 4 machine gun positions, 9, maybe more further back, and between them, dozens of rifle positions. The entire ridgeline fortified into an integrated defensive system that must have taken days to establish. Company C had not walked into a rearguard force. They had walked into a full company strength position, possibly reinforced to battalion level, which meant the American force was outnumbered at least 2 to 1 and caught in the worst possible tactical situation. For a moment, the enormity of it threatened to overwhelm him. What could one man with 1 rifle do against such a force? The training answer was nothing. You were supposed to observe, report, and let the combined arms system of artillery, air support, and massed infantry deal with fixed positions. But there was no time for that process, and every second that passed meant more of his fellow soldiers trapped in that kill zone, unable to advance or retreat. Slowly being whittled down by fire, they could not effectively return. That was when Washington closed his eyes and whispered the prayer that had come to him unbidden, rising from a place deeper than military training, deeper than tactical assessment, deeper than fear or doubt. God guide my hands, Ewun. It was not a sophisticated prayer. It was not a request for divine intervention or a plea for miraculous deliverance. It was simply a recognition that he was about to attempt something that required more than just skill, more than just courage, more than just luck. It required a steadiness that came from somewhere beyond himself, a certainty that every shot mattered and that he could not afford to miss. Washington opened his eyes, settled into a prone position behind the best cover the rock formation offered, and began his work. The first target was a machine gun position on the northern end of the German line, marked by the distinctive rapid pulse of the MG-42. He could not see the soldiers manning the weapon, only the muzzle flash, but years of hunting had taught him to visualize the entire picture from partial information. The gun would be sandbagged, probably with a crew of 3 or 4, one firing, one feeding ammunition, one or two ready to take over when the barrel needed changing, or if casualties occurred. The flash appeared to be coming from a position perhaps 2 meters behind the actual ridgeline, set back to avoid being silhouetted. Washington adjusted his aim point to account for the setback position, the elevation difference, the distance of approximately 230 meters, and the cold air that would slow the bullet slightly. He placed the crosshairs of his scope not on the muzzle flash itself, but on a point 15 centimeters to the left and 8 centimeters up, where he estimated the head of the primary gunner would be based on standard German machine gun employment. He exhaled slowly, steadied his breathing, and squeezed the trigger with gradually increasing pressure until the rifle fired almost as a surprise to his conscious mind. The M1903 kicked against his shoulder, the report sharp in the cold air. Washington worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round, keeping his scope on the target area. The machine gun continued firing for perhaps 3 more seconds, then suddenly went silent. He waited, watching for the assistant gunner to take over, which should happen within 10 to 15 seconds if the crew was well trained. 20 seconds passed. 30. The machine gun remained silent. Washington allowed himself one small moment of satisfaction, then shifted to the next target. Over the next 11 minutes, Corporal James Washington fired 23 rounds from his Springfield rifle. Of those 23 shots, 21 found their marks. A success rate that seems impossible to anyone unfamiliar with what dedicated practice and natural ability can achieve. He worked methodically, targeting first the machine gun positions that posed the greatest threat to the pinned American soldiers, then shifting to positions that appeared to be command or observation posts based on the concentration of activity around them. Each shot required complete recalculation. The fog layer was not uniform, and it shifted with subtle air movements that changed the visibility at the target end, even when his end remained clear. The distance to different positions varied from 190 meters to almost 300 meters, each requiring different elevation adjustment on his scope. The cold affected both his hands and the rifle's performance, contracting the metal in ways that minutely changed the bullet's trajectory. And always, there was the knowledge that every muzzle flash he created gave away his position, that at any moment, the German forces might identify his location and bring concentrated fire on his exposed position atop the rock outcropping. But Washington had learned long ago to quiet the voice of fear, to enter a state of focus so complete that the world narrowed to crosshairs and targets, breathing and trigger control, the mathematics of wind and distance translated into unconscious physical action. His grandfather had called it becoming the stillness, the moment when you stopped being a person doing a thing and simply became the thing itself. Washington was not a soldier shooting a rifle. He was the shot itself, the intention made manifest, the answer to a problem written in physics and will. Below him, Sergeant Hayes and the 2 privates watched in something approaching awe. None of them could see what Washington saw from his elevated position, but they could see the results. The volume of fire from the German positions began to slacken as machine guns went silent, as leadership positions were eliminated, as the coordinated defense began to lose its coordination. They could hear the change in the sound of the engagement, the shift from overwhelming German fire advantage to something more equal, more confused, more uncertain. In the command area where Captain Morrison crouched with his radio operator, desperately trying to reach battalion headquarters through the fog-disrupted communications, the change was even more apparent. The buzzsaw rattle of multiple MG-42s that had created an impenetrable wall of fire was now reduced to sporadic bursts from what sounded like only 2 or 3 weapons. The interlocking fields of fire that had made movement suicidal were developing gaps, blind spots, opportunities. "Something is happening on the German line," Lieutenant Bradley reported, having crawled back from 2nd Platoon's position. "Their fire is decreasing, and it is not because they are repositioning. Some of their positions have gone completely silent. I think someone is taking them out systematically." Morrison suddenly understood. Washington, he must have a position where he can see over the fog. That magnificent son of a gun is taking apart their whole defensive line by himself. But even as Morrison said it, even as hope began to replace desperation, Washington faced his greatest challenge yet. He had identified what appeared to be the German command position, marked by a cluster of activity, centered around what his scope revealed to be a rock formation, not unlike the one he occupied, approximately 270 meters distant. He had observed what appeared to be an officer, identifiable by different uniform details and by the deference other soldiers showed him, coordinating the defensive fire. Eliminating that position might break the coherence of the entire German defense, but it was also the most protected position, with multiple soldiers around it and the best natural cover on the ridgeline. Moreover, Washington was running low on ammunition. He had started with 40 rounds in his pouches, 23 fired, 17 remaining. He needed to make the next shots count, because once he exhausted his ammunition, his ability to influence this engagement ended. He observed the command position for 90 seconds, noting patterns of movement, identifying gaps in the protection when the officer moved to look at different parts of the engagement area. The range was long, longer than most of his previous shots, and the target would be exposed for only brief moments. He would likely get only one shot before the entire position went to ground and disappeared behind cover. Washington adjusted his scope for the longer distance, factored in a slight crosswind he could feel at his elevated position that would not be present down in the valley, and settled his breathing into the slow rhythm that preceded his best shots. He placed the crosshairs on the space where he expected the officer to appear based on the movement pattern he had observed. 10 seconds passed. 20. Washington remained absolutely still, finger resting lightly on the trigger, the entire world reduced to that space in his scope, and the patience to wait for the fraction of a second when everything aligned. The German officer stepped into view, turning to gesture toward the northern part of the line, where Washington's earlier shots had silenced multiple positions. The movement brought him into perfect profile, head and shoulders clearly visible above the rock that provided his cover. Washington's rifle fired. The shot was perfect, the officer dropping from view instantly. But Washington did not have time to confirm the hit, because at that moment, the entire character of the engagement transformed. Whether it was the loss of the commanding officer, or the cumulative effect of multiple positions being neutralized, or simply the psychological impact of facing an enemy who could strike with precision through conditions that should have made precision impossible, the German defense suddenly collapsed. The remaining machine gun positions ceased firing almost simultaneously. Washington could see through his scope soldiers abandoning their positions, retreating back over the ridgeline toward secondary positions further up the mountain. "They are pulling back," Hayes called up from below. "Washington, they are retreating. Whatever you did, you broke them." Captain Morrison, seizing the moment with the tactical instinct that had earned him his rank, despite his relative inexperience, immediately ordered the company to advance. The American soldiers, released from the paralysis of being pinned under fire, surged forward with a fury born of relief and survival. Second platoon, which had been trapped nearest to the German positions and had taken the heaviest casualties, led the charge with Lieutenant Bradley at its head. The ridgeline, which 15 minutes earlier had bristled with an integrated defense that should have held against a force twice the size of Company C, was now effectively abandoned. The American soldiers swept over it and established their own defensive positions, preparing for a counterattack that never came. The German forces, their command structure disrupted and their defensive coherence shattered, continued their retreat up the mountain, ceding the entire valley approach that had been Company C's objective. Washington climbed down from his rocky perch as the fog finally began to lift with the warming of the mid-morning sun. His hands were shaking now, delayed reaction setting in as the focus of combat gave way to the aftermath. He had fired 24 rounds total, the last shot at the command position, bringing the count to an even 24. 17 rounds remained in his pouches. 24 shots had been sufficient to fundamentally alter the tactical situation and save his company from potential destruction. When he reached the captured ridgeline, he found Captain Morrison organizing the defensive perimeter, while medics moved among the wounded. The company had taken 18 casualties in the engagement, 3 of them serious enough to require immediate evacuation. Given what had seemed likely 20 minutes earlier, when the entire company was pinned in the killing zone, those numbers represented a miracle of small cost. Without Washington's intervention, casualty estimates would have been measured in dozens, possibly including the complete loss of 2nd Platoon. The wounded men lay in various states of injury and shock, some quietly accepting treatment from the medics, others struggling with pain or fear or both. Washington recognized several of them, men he had eaten with, trained with, shared foxholes with during cold nights, when body heat was the only way to stay warm enough to function. Private First Class Marcus Jenkins, who had grown up in Chicago and who had taught Washington how to play bid whist during the long evenings when they were in reserve positions, sat propped against a tree with his leg splintered, his face pale but his voice steady, as he told the medic treating him that he had felt worse after high school football games. Staff Sergeant William Hayes approached Washington as he stood there, trying to process the scene, trying to reconcile the relief of survival with the cost still being counted around him. Hayes, who had been with Washington at the outcropping and had watched him work, put a hand on the younger man's shoulder and squeezed it briefly, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement that required no words. They stood there together for a moment, two men who had shared danger and come through it, understanding without discussion that what had happened in the last hour would bind them together, for whatever time they had remaining, whether that was days or years. The men of 2nd Platoon, who had been trapped in the most exposed position and who had taken the heaviest casualties, began gathering around Washington as word spread that he was the one who had broken the German defense. At first they came individually, offering brief words of thanks, but soon a small group had formed, maybe a dozen men, all looking at him with expressions that mixed gratitude with something approaching awe. Private Leroy Jackson, a quiet man from Mississippi who rarely spoke unless directly addressed, stepped forward from the group. His uniform was torn and dirt-streaked, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of close combat, but his voice was clear when he spoke. "Corporal Washington, I need you to know something. I need you to understand what you did for us. When we were pinned down there, when those machine guns had us locked in place and we could not move forward or back, I was certain I was going to die. I was certain that I would never see my wife again, never meet the baby she is carrying, never go home. I had accepted it. I was just trying to figure out how to make it count, how to die in a way that might give someone else a chance." Then the fire started to decrease. Then Lieutenant Bradley was yelling at us to move. Then we were running forward, and the positions that should have cut us down were silent. "You gave me my life back, sir. You gave all of us our lives back. That is not something I will ever forget." Others in the group nodded, adding their own brief confirmations, their own acknowledgements of debt that could never truly be repaid, because how do you repay someone for your entire future, for every moment you would live and experience and treasure that would have been erased without their intervention? Washington, deeply uncomfortable with the attention and unsure how to respond to such direct and overwhelming gratitude, could only nod and say quietly, "We are all here to look after each other. What I did is what any of you would have done if you had been in that position with that rifle. We are a unit. We survive together or we do not survive at all." But even as he said it, even as he tried to deflect the recognition back to the collective effort, he could see in their eyes that they did not believe the deflection, that they understood exactly what he had done and how exceptional it had been. The experience created a strange kind of isolation, setting him apart even as it bound him more tightly to these men. He was one of them, but he was also now something else, someone who had done the impossible thing, and that difference would follow him for as long as he served with this unit. Morrison saw Washington approaching and crossed to meet him. The captain was a tall man, nearly 6 feet 3 inches, and Washington was only 5 feet 9, but in that moment, Morrison looked up to the younger man with an expression that held no trace of the unconscious condescension that had colored their earlier interactions. "Sergeant Hayes tells me you took out 9 machine gun positions and multiple other targets," Morrison said quietly. "He says you did it in about 10 minutes of sustained, precise fire through conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. Is that assessment correct?" Washington, uncomfortable with attention and unsure how to respond to praise from an officer who had never previously acknowledged him beyond necessary military courtesy, simply nodded. I did what needed doing, sir. The outcropping provided elevation that allowed me to see their positions. Once I could see them, engaging them was a matter of proper technique. Proper technique, Morrison repeated, and a strange smile crossed his face. Corporal, I have seen Olympic-level marksmen who could not do what you just did. I watched muzzle flashes wink out one after another, like someone was walking down a line flipping switches. Lieutenant Bradley is recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. I am going to recommend you for the Medal of Honor. Washington felt his stomach tighten. The Medal of Honor was the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for valor in action against an enemy force. In the entire history of the American military, up to that point in the conflict, no black soldier had received the Medal of Honor for actions in the current conflict, though several had received it in previous conflicts. The idea that his actions could be considered worthy of such recognition seemed incomprehensible to a man who had grown up being told that people who looked like him were inherently inferior, inherently less capable, inherently less courageous than white soldiers. "Sir, I was just doing my job," Washington protested. Any designated marksman would have done the same given the position and the opportunity. Morrison shook his head firmly. "No, Corporal, not any marksman. Most would have frozen facing those odds. Most would have fired a few rounds and then taken cover when return fire started searching for them. You stayed exposed on that rock and systematically dismantled an entire defensive line while bullets were looking for you. You saved this company, and you saved specifically the lives of dozens of men who would have died in that killing zone. That deserves recognition at the highest level." What Washington did not know, could not know in that moment, was that Morrison's recommendation would begin a journey through the military bureaucracy that would ultimately take 53 years to complete. The Medal of Honor recommendation would be downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross, which itself would be downgraded to a Silver Star, which would be downgraded to a Bronze Star with V device for valor, and that Bronze Star would not be officially awarded until 1946, more than a year after the conflict ended in Europe. The reasons for these downgrades were never officially documented, but soldiers and historians who studied the case later understood the truth. The military establishment of that era could not bring itself to award its highest honors to black soldiers at the same rate or with the same standards applied to white soldiers, no matter how clearly they deserved such recognition. But the story does not end there, because truth has a way of surviving even when institutions try to bury it. Lieutenant Bradley spent the evening of October 15th interviewing every man who had witnessed or benefited from Washington's actions. He compiled a detailed account that included not just the tactical results, but the specific human lives saved, naming each soldier who would have likely died without Washington's intervention. He gathered testimony from Sergeant Hayes and the two privates who had provided security at the outcropping, documenting Washington's exposed position and the sustained danger he had faced. He even sketched a map showing the German positions and the sequence in which they had been neutralized, demonstrating the tactical sophistication of Washington's targeting priorities. Bradley's report eventually filled 18 pages of single-spaced typing, a document far more detailed than typically accompanied medal recommendations. He submitted it through proper channels, but he also made copies, sending one to his family in Detroit with instructions to keep it safe, sending another to the headquarters of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, sending a third to a journalist he knew who covered the black press. Bradley understood that official recognition might be delayed or denied, but he was determined that the truth would survive somewhere, somehow. Word of the engagement spread rapidly through the 92nd Division and beyond. The story simplified and amplified in the retelling, as stories do, until it became the tale of one soldier who had held off an entire German battalion single-handedly. That version was exaggerated, but the truth was remarkable enough. Other black soldiers began to repeat the story to each other, drawing strength from it, using it as evidence against the institutional narrative that claimed they were not capable of the same heroism as white soldiers. Company C continued to fight through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. Washington participated in numerous subsequent engagements, his reputation as a marksman leading to his being positioned wherever precision fire was most needed. He never again faced a situation quite like October 15th, but he continued to perform his duties with the same steady competence that had characterized his actions on that foggy morning. In April of 1945, 3 weeks before the German armed forces surrendered and the conflict in Europe ended, Washington took a piece of shrapnel from an artillery round that detonated near his position during a routine defensive action. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, but it severed nerves in his right shoulder, ending his effectiveness as a precision marksman. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a larger facility in France, then eventually shipped back to the United States for recovery and discharge. He returned to Tuskegee in July of 1945 with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a right arm that would never again have the strength and steadiness required for the kind of shooting that had once come as naturally as breathing. He returned to an America that had not changed nearly as much as he had, to a segregated South, where signs still directed him to separate entrances and separate facilities, where the uniform he had worn meant nothing to people who cared only about the color of his skin. Washington married his childhood sweetheart, Evelyn, in 1946. They had 4 children together. He worked various jobs over the years: mechanic, factory supervisor, eventually a teacher at the local high school where he taught mathematics and coached the rifle team. He almost never spoke about the conflict, rarely attended veteran gatherings, and maintained only sporadic contact with the men he had served with. The Bronze Star and Purple Heart went into a drawer, examined occasionally by his children who asked questions he answered briefly and without detail. For decades, that appeared to be the end of the story. One man who had done extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, recognized minimally, returning to ordinary life and ordinary obscurity. But Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, who had gone on to become a lawyer and civil rights advocate after the conflict, had never forgotten. The detailed report he had compiled in October of 1944 remained in his files, and as the years passed and the civil rights movement gained momentum, Bradley began to wonder if the time might finally be right to revisit cases where black soldiers had been denied proper recognition for valor. In 1992, nearly 50 years after the events in the Vosges Mountains, Bradley was contacted by a military historian named Dr. Sarah Morrison, who happened to be the daughter of Captain Robert Morrison. The younger Morrison was researching her father's service and had found references in his personal papers to the engagement on October 15th and to Corporal James Washington. She tracked down Bradley, who was by then 74 years old and long retired from his law practice, and asked if he remembered the incident. Bradley not only remembered, he still had his copies of the detailed report he had compiled. He provided them to Dr. Morrison, who was shocked by what she read and by the discrepancy between the actions described and the minimal award Washington had received. She began her own investigation, combing through military archives, tracking down surviving veterans of Company C, building a comprehensive case that Washington's actions had been worthy of far greater recognition than he had received. Dr. Morrison's research revealed a pattern that had affected not just Washington, but dozens of black soldiers whose valor had been systematically undervalued during the conflict era. In 1996, the military commissioned a formal review of African American valor awards from the Second World War, examining cases where recommendations for high-level decorations had been downgraded or denied. Washington's case was among those reviewed. The review board, examining the evidence compiled by Lieutenant Bradley nearly 52 years earlier and supplemented by Dr. Morrison's research, concluded that the original recommendation for the Medal of Honor had been entirely justified, and that the decision to downgrade the award had been based on racial prejudice rather than military criteria. In January of 1997, the review board recommended that 7 black soldiers from the Second World War be awarded the Medal of Honor, with Corporal James Washington among them. On April 12, 1997, President William Clinton presided over a ceremony at the White House where those 7 Medals of Honor were finally awarded. By that time, only one of the 7 recipients was still alive to receive the medal in person. James Washington had passed away 5 years earlier, in 1992 at the age of 70. His widow Evelyn, then 72 years old, accepted the medal on his behalf, along with 2 of their 4 children and 7 grandchildren. The citation that accompanied the award detailed Washington's actions on October 15, 1944, describing how he had engaged and neutralized multiple enemy positions while under fire, breaking a defensive line that threatened to destroy his entire company and directly saving the lives of approximately 47 soldiers who had been trapped in the killing zone. The citation did not capture the cold, the fear, the prayer whispered into the fog, the steadiness of hand that came from steadiness of heart, the weight of representing not just himself, but everyone who looked like him every time he went into action. Those details lived only in memory and in the stories that surviving veterans told their families. Among those attending the ceremony was Raymond Coleman, one of the two privates who had provided security at the base of the outcropping 53 years earlier. Coleman, then 76 years old, and walking with difficulty due to wounds received later in the conflict, approached Evelyn Washington after the ceremony. "Ma'am, I do not know if your husband ever told you about that day," Coleman said quietly. "I do not know if he told you what it was like watching him work, but I need you to know that I should have died that morning. 2nd Platoon, we were right in the middle of that killing zone, and we could not move forward and we could not fall back, and the fire just kept coming. Then suddenly the fire started to slacken, and we could hear our own officers yelling that we needed to move, that something had changed. We learned later it was James who changed it. One man with one rifle sitting exposed on a rock, taking apart an entire defensive line, because it was what needed doing. I lived to have a family, to see my children grow up, to meet my grandchildren. I got to live a whole life that should have ended that morning, and I got to live it because your husband was that steady and that brave and that skilled. I just wanted you to know that someone remembered. Someone knows what he gave us." Evelyn Washington, who had lived with a quiet man who rarely spoke of the conflict and who had carried his modesty and his pain with equal privacy, began to cry. Her children put their arms around her, and together they stood in the White House, holding a medal that had taken 53 years to arrive, knowing that recognition delayed for decades was still recognition, still mattered, still spoke truth even if it spoke too late for the man who earned it to hear. The story of James Washington's actions on October 15, 1944, eventually became part of the curriculum at Army sniper schools, studied as an example of how individual marksman skills could influence tactical situations. The specific details of the engagement, the fog conditions, the elevated position, the systematic targeting priorities, all became teaching points for soldiers learning how to apply precision fire in combat situations. But beyond the tactical lessons, Washington's story became something more significant. It became evidence, one documented case among many, of how institutional prejudice had denied proper recognition to black soldiers, whose actions met or exceeded the standards applied to white soldiers. It contributed to a broader reckoning within the military about its history of discrimination and to ongoing efforts to identify and correct cases where racial prejudice had affected awards and recognition. For the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, who had served alongside Washington, the medal ceremony in 1997 provided a sense of vindication that went beyond one man's recognition. It acknowledged what they had always known, that they had fought with courage equal to any other soldiers, that they had proven themselves in combat repeatedly, that the skepticism and prejudice they had faced from their own army had been unjust and unfounded. The medal was for Washington, but in a sense it was for all of them, a long-delayed recognition that their service had been genuine, their sacrifice real, their valor worthy of the nation's highest honors. Today, more than 80 years after that foggy morning in the Vosges Mountains, the story continues to resonate. It appears in books about the war, in documentaries about African-American military history, in museums dedicated to preserving the stories of those who served. A photograph of Evelyn Washington receiving the Medal of Honor on her husband's behalf hangs in the Buffalo Soldier Museum in Houston, Texas. A memorial plaque was placed in Tuskegee, Alabama, in the small cemetery where James Washington is buried, noting that the grave holds a Medal of Honor recipient whose actions saved 47 lives and whose recognition took 53 years to arrive. The rifle Washington carried that day, the M1903 Springfield with its mounted scope, was donated to the Smithsonian Institution by his family in 2003. It sits now in a display about African-American military service, accompanied by a placard that tells a shortened version of the story and by a photograph of Washington in uniform, young and serious, looking directly at the camera with eyes that had seen both the worst and the best of what humans could be to each other. Perhaps most significantly, Washington's story has been incorporated into discussions about bias in military decorations and award systems. Researchers studying patterns in Valor Awards have used his case as a clear example of how identical or similar actions received different levels of recognition depending on the race of the soldier involved. This research has contributed to policy changes designed to ensure more equitable evaluation of valor, to training for awards review boards about unconscious bias, to systems that flag statistical anomalies that might indicate discrimination. The prayer Washington whispered on that October morning, asking for guidance, was answered not just in the steadiness that allowed him to place 24 shots with devastating precision, but in the long journey toward justice that his story eventually traveled. It was answered in Lieutenant Bradley's determination to preserve the truth, in Dr. Morrison's commitment to uncover it, in a review board's willingness to examine the past honestly, in a ceremony that happened decades too late, but that happened nonetheless. For those 47 men whose lives were saved by Washington's actions, and for their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because those men survived October 15, 1944, the story has always been personal. They have carried it forward, ensuring that each new generation knows that their family lines continued because one man on a rock in the fog chose to stand exposed, to place his life at risk, to do the impossible because it was necessary. The full measure of Washington's impact cannot be calculated merely in tactical terms, in enemy positions neutralized or attacks disrupted. It must be measured in lives lived, in families created, in potential fulfilled. Every one of those 47 soldiers had a future that would have been erased if the engagement had gone differently. Some became teachers, doctors, factory workers, farmers, artists, activists. They raised families, contributed to their communities, lived the ordinary, extraordinary lives that constitute the fabric of a society. All of that happened because James Washington, son of a railroad worker and a domestic worker, grandson of a man born into slavery, was given a rifle and a position from which he could see what needed to be done, and then did it with a precision that seemed almost superhuman, but was actually profoundly human, the result of skill and courage and character combined in one critical moment. In the end, the story of October 15, 1944 in the Vosges Mountains is not really a story about weapons or tactics or even about combat. It is a story about what one person can do when they draw on everything they have been taught, everything they have practiced, everything they believe about their own worth and the worth of those they serve alongside. It is a story about faith, though not necessarily the kind expressed in churches. It is faith in the steadiness of one's own hands, faith in the value of one's fellow soldiers, faith that doing the right thing matters even when the world is slow to recognize it. James Washington climbed down from that rock outcropping, knowing he had done good work. He could not have known that his actions would reverberate across decades, that they would eventually contribute to a reckoning with institutional prejudice, that they would become a teaching example for future generations of soldiers. He simply knew he had done what was necessary when it was necessary, and that the men of his company, the men who fought beside him and whom he fought to protect, would live to see another day. For a soldier in combat, there is perhaps no greater accomplishment, no truer measure of success. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.